Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Katie Rahm, the Senior Vice President for Marketing and Communications here at the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the museum and tonight's member program celebrating the exhibition Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. This retrospective, organized in collaboration with the Brooklyn Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., showcases Catlett's awe-inspiring artistic career, highlighting the significant role she played in her time, as well as how her artwork continues to resonate today. It is my privilege to welcome a room full of museum members tonight. Coming together like this is what makes the Art Institute such a meaningful gathering place. Thank you for being such an active part of our member community and for sharing in this opportunity to experience the life and work of Elizabeth Catlett. I also want to give a very warm welcome to all the museum's civic partners joining us from the city of Chicago, from the Chicago Park District, from the Chicago Public Libraries, from the Southside Community Art Center, and from a number of other organizations dedicated to the advancement of art, culture, and community from across our city. As you'll hear tonight, Chicago and Chicago institutions played a significant role in Catlett's trajectory, and it is so meaningful that you are here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter and one of my very favorite colleagues, Sarah Kelly Oehler. Sarah is the Field-McCormick Chair and Curator of the Arts of the Americas, as well as the museum's Vice President of Curatorial Strategy. Sarah joined the Art Institute more than 20 years ago and has developed acclaimed exhibitions, conducted groundbreaking research, and stewarded important acquisitions. In addition to being the curator of Elizabeth Catlett, some recent exhibitions she curated that you are likely familiar with include Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, Charles White, A Retrospective, and America After the Fall, Painting in the 1930s. You are all really in for a treat tonight. So now please join me in welcoming Sarah to the stage.
All right, hello everybody. It is my pleasure as well to thank you for joining us tonight for this preview of Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. As Katie mentioned, this was organized in collaboration with the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art. It's been at those two venues, and it's so exciting to have it here finally in Chicago. All right, so I thought I would start this lecture tonight with a little bit of a story, and that is that in May of 1970, Elizabeth Catlett, who had been living in Mexico since 1946, applied for a visa to visit the United States. Now, her purpose was to speak, in fact, at a conference up in Evanston. It was called the Conference on the Functional Aspects of Black Art, and it was being held at Northwestern University. But you might be wondering immediately why Catlett, who after all was an American born in Washington, D.C., needed to apply for a visa. But the story was, or the reality was, that 8 years prior, in 1962, Catlett received dual citizenship from Mexico. And the United States government responded by immediately revoking her American citizenship. They declared her an undesirable alien for her politics and her very open willingness to express those politics through her art. And so in 1970, when she applied for this visa, not for the first time, she was denied. But despite this setback, Catlett remained undaunted. She gave her speech by telephone to the assembled audience in Northwestern. And I want you to imagine this for a second. This is 1970. This is not, you don't get out your cell phone and call up Northwestern. There's no Zoom, so forth. She manages to get on the telephone, and she spoke quite openly about this visa denial. And you can see the quote here. But she said, "I was refused on the grounds that as a foreigner, there was a possibility that I would interfere in social or political problems, and thus I constituted a threat to the well-being of the United States of America. To the degree and in the proportion that the United States constitute a threat to Black people, to that degree and more, do I hope I have earned that honor." Yeah. But then she ended, "For I have been and am currently and always hope to be a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies." Powerful statement. And indeed, these words and her determination speak volumes about her philosophy of art and activism. As a Black woman living first in the United States and then in Mexico, she saw and experienced on a regular basis how social and racial injustice had held her people back, and she committed herself artistically and politically to fighting these powerful entrenched forces. As she said, she wanted to be a Black revolutionary artist, and we see it expressed so powerfully in works such as these. But she added on this tail that I kind of love, and it's this phrase, "all that it implies," because I think that's a really wonderful, sort of very capacious self-definition that encourages us to think beyond just the obvious and think about the many nuances to this idea of Catlett being a revolutionary. And so I want to give you just one example, and that's her subject matter, because in many of her works, she focused on working-class Black and Mexican women. They're doing everyday things. They're cooking meals, or they're simply sitting there feeling tired. Now, this might not, to our eyes today, frankly, our eyes that see a lot of things, feel particularly radical. But this moment of hers, this lifelong moment, as a matter of fact, to choose to depict women of color was in self extremely revolutionary. This was a moment in time when she saw no such representation. There was no positive representation in the fine arts, and certainly not an authentic representation. And so that became a bold political and social stance on Catlett's part. So the exhibition that we have here explores her career holistically. It's really meant to showcase all aspects of her artistic production, and that includes paintings, but as well the prints and sculptures for which she's better known. And I should say, there's been actually many exhibitions of her prints, for example. There's been some exhibitions of her sculptures, but very rarely have you seen all of this work together. And I think it's really amazing to see the incredible diversity of her artistic practice over many decades. And so the exhibition, and I'm hoping you do go in there, is organized roughly chronologically, we'll say, but it's also with interrelated thematic groups. And that's because throughout her entire career, she had a steadfast commitment to artistic excellence and to social justice that resonates across sort of different particular subjects. So as a result, a crucial part of the show really does focus on how her artistic practice bolstered her activism. She very much considered it her obligation as a Black artist to excel artistically. She said, "Technique is so important. It's the difference between art and ineptitude. Because our audiences deserve the best, we must equip ourselves to give them the very best." This really was about exploring and determining the best way of conveying a message. So this could include everything from the ancestral legacies of traditional African and pre-Columbian sculpture, and I think you see that really beautifully in the head that's on loan from the DuSable here in Chicago. But she also kept her style fresh, and she continually evolved. So for example, she incorporated many ideas from international pop art, as we see in Angela Libre. And so here in particular, I think there's this bold color choice, and of course, the use of repetition, but also what you might not realize until you're in person is that she actually printed this onto silver foil, which is not easy. And so I think we see her also as an experimenter, one who's interested in different materials and how those materials could convey what she was trying to say. Now, Catlett was also keenly aware, as a result, of the way that her preferred media could in fact convey different ideas, and specifically contrasted the possibilities of printmaking versus sculpture in her work. She said, "I'm thinking differently in the two mediums. In printmaking, I'm thinking about something social or political. And in sculpture, I'm thinking about form. She recognized they functioned in different ways. And so one of the things I think you'll see is that her prints do, in fact, often carry a very direct or pointed meaning, but many of her sculptures are much more universal. They're more sumptuous. They're more sort of, tactile. Don't touch them, but you want to. And the alarms will go off. And that's because she's exploring these different ideas. And I just love here this pairing. You can see how she's interested in similar formal ideas across different media and how different they appear. So I'm truly delighted that the Art Institute has a chance to celebrate the exceptional art and indomitable spirit of Elizabeth Catlett here at the Art Institute. And I will say, I'm obviously completely biased, but I think there's no better location because, as Katie mentioned, she did spend a very formative part of her career, a short part, but very formative part, here in our own city. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I thought for the rest of our time tonight, I'll interweave some of the aspects of her biography that are particularly relevant with her art, and then some of the ways that this shows up in the themes of the show. Now, speaking of Chicago, before you even walk into the exhibition space, I want to encourage you to look up, because hanging to the left of the gallery entrance, we feature in Griffin Court a gorgeous wood sculpture called Floating Family. And this is actually a depiction of a mother and daughter clasping hands, as you can see, that's on loan from the Chicago Public Library, and the Legler branch specifically. And it normally hangs over the exhibition, or the circulation desk, which is really wonderful. And I think that this is a great piece to introduce the show, because she was a dedicated educator for her entire life. And it's commissions like this that really inspired her. She said, "I was excited just about the prospect of people sitting there, of Black people sitting in that building reading." She firmly believed that all people should have access to art, and she also equally fervently believed that she had a sort of responsibility to bring it to people in their own communities. And so commissions such as Floating Family really allowed her to do so on a grand scale. Catlett, as I mentioned, was born in Washington, D.C. in 1915. And her parents were the children of enslaved people, so she's, not removed very far. And they themselves worked in education. So clearly this was an important influence on the young Elizabeth, who you see here with her siblings. She was early on interested in art, and in 1931, she enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Now, importantly, this was not her first choice. And so a defining moment in her life was when she was denied entrance at Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh because of her race. So instead, she went to Howard. But this choice ended up being incredibly beneficial because Howard had already established itself as a leading educational institution for Black students, and particularly those with an interest in art. At Howard, she studied with key figures such as Lois Mallow Jones, who you can see here, James Porter, and so many others. But also, Howard had an art gallery, which was crucial because it brought in exhibitions that allowed her to see art firsthand, which was not an opportunity otherwise available in the segregated Washington, D.C. of the time. She said, quote, "Washington was Jim Crow then, and we didn't have a chance to go to many things." So Howard really helped with that situation. Now at Howard, she also received a rigorous education in drawing and design, which we see in these two works, and this was actually her initial major, was design. And so in the student drawing on the left, you can really see her demonstrating her drafting skills. She's got a tremendous command of form, of line, of how to model and create textural variety. And I have to say that I love the work on the right, which is called Hats by Susie White. It's a painting, I'm not entirely sure, we don't really know if it was a practice example or an actual advertisement she created, but it's this lively tempera painting that gives evidence of her early ability to balance image and text, and that certainly becomes important in later years. Now, after graduating from Howard, Catlett began the first of many teaching positions. But she soon decided to return to school for an advanced degree, and that was in part because she was getting underpaid as a Black teacher. So in 1938, she enrolled at the University of Iowa, where she, in fact, went on to earn the first Master's in Fine Arts ever granted to a Black woman. What's amazing is that her teacher and advisor at Iowa was Grant Wood, who was the painter of American Gothic, which by 1930 was already here at the Art Institute. So he was already sort of nationally famous. And Wood was very influential. She went to him because she wanted to be a painter, but he actually encouraged her to take up sculpture. He said, essentially this would be a better medium for you. He also wanted her very much to focus on subjects of relevance to her and to her community. He didn't want her to be alienated from her own subject matter. And then lastly, he started pushing her gently towards a sort of subtle use of stylized form. And that was something that she would embrace more fully in the next few years, as I'll get to in a second. But for the moment, at Iowa, she completes her thesis sculpture in 1940, which she called Negro Mother and Child. So she's demonstrating already that she's taken Wood's advice to heart. This stone carving, first of all, is beautifully naturalistic. It's unlocated now, but at least from the photos is what we think. This was really her first attempt to depict motherhood in sculpture. And she wrote in her thesis statement that the, quote, implications of motherhood, especially Negro motherhood, are quite important to me, as I am a Negro as well as a woman. So there's Wood's advice on the page. Now, later that same year, she exhibited the sculpture at the monumental American Negro Exposition in Chicago. So once again, sort of intertwining with Chicago. And this was a massive display that opened on July 4th, 1940, in celebration of the 75th anniversary of the abolition of slavery by the 13th Amendment. And Catlett's carving won first place in sculpture, and she really beat out a number of very established artists. And so this award brought her significant national visibility. Catlett then moves to Chicago for the summer of 1941. And she roomed with Margaret Taylor Goss Burroughs, who hopefully is a familiar name to many around the city for example, founding the DuSable. And Catlett quickly became a member of the vibrant community of leftist artists on the South Side. That included Burroughs, who was her roommate, but also Charles White, who Catlett would marry in December. Catlett worked at the Southside Community Arts Center, and she also studied ceramics at the School of the Art Institute. So she's sort of toggling between downtown and the South Side. Now, unfortunately, and this is, of course, a historian's sad recognition, no works are known that can be conclusively proven to date from her summer in Chicago. But she did recall it being a very productive time. She said, "It was a fulfilling summer. I felt like I was progressing." So she's learning, she's talking to everybody, and she did work, as we know from her recollections, on a stone carving of a man. And it's very possible that the head of a man, now in the Art Institute's collection, was this work. And I've had lengthy conversations with the other curators about this. Stylistically, it's so aligned with this moment in her career, in that she's still using a naturalistic language, but her forms are getting a little more sharply defined, but she hasn't sort of gone full cubism, which is where she ends up in just a year or two. And again, there's very few sculptures that are known to exist still from this moment. So I'm showing you here an archival photograph that we located of a sculpture that she dated to 1944. And this is important because this is a very fast change for her. And that's because she moves to New York in 1942 and starts studying with a Russian-born French sculptor named Osip Zadkine. And he actually encouraged her to really explore African art in search of abstraction. And she said, "It had never occurred to me that the study of African art could be a way of learning about abstract forms." So this teaching and this sort of study of African art really enabled her to move quickly from Grant Wood's gentle stylization to a much greater embrace of abstraction in sculptural form, as she was emphasizing angularity and geometries and really reducing the human figure to essential planes. And you see this then persist for her entire career, where she's toggling between different stylistic languages. Now, in New York, as in Chicago, Catlett quickly joined a vibrant community of Black artistic, creative, and dancers, thinkers. She's living in the same apartment building as Langston Hughes. She's sort of in this great milieu. And she begins working at the George Washington Carver School in Harlem. And it's very much like the Southside Community Art Center. It's about bringing education to working class people in their own neighborhood. Catlett was their fundraiser and a promotion director. She taught sculpture and she taught dressmaking. So she's teaching a range of courses. And what's fascinating, and you can see this is How to Make a Dress is her course. The Carver School was very much a Marxist-oriented school. And so apparently even the most innocuous of topics, such as dressmaking, could lead to political discussion. Catlett later said, "People asked me, how do you teach Marxism making a dress?" But she went on to say, well, while we're sewing, we talk, And so Catlett was seizing opportunities as the educator she was to bring ideas and information about politics, world events, and so many other ideas to her students. But her students also did inspire her. She actually started painting a number of them, and Woman with the Green Hat seems to be one of them, because she said, suddenly I wanted to draw these people, these women who were to me so strong and so wonderful, and from whom I was learning a lot. And I love in this work, this is pretty small, but I love how Catlett has captured this woman's completely skeptical expression, I think really sort of conveying her personality. But Catlett's time in New York coincided with the entry of the United States into World War II. And for Elizabeth Catlett, like so many Black artists of the time, it was incredibly dismaying to see how many Black Americans were playing integral roles in the global struggle for freedom, even as they were subject to segregation and racial injustice at home in the United States. And this was not a protest limited to artistic communities, but she was responding in turn with her art. And her works really set out in her works to call attention to the sacrifice and determination of particularly Black women during the war years, and although not exclusively. So I'm showing you Red Cross woman or nurse, where you see her sort of giving this figure, this wonderful uplifted gesture of her chin, but there's also the shadows under her eyes, suggesting both determination and the weariness of this. And this was based on widespread reporting in Black newspapers about the discrimination faced by Black nurses who were in medical units but then facing segregation. And so Catlett's sort of seeing all this and very determinedly endowing this subject with heroic notes, I think, sort of positioning her as vital to the war effort. We see her in some of these works again, now in painting, continuing to explore abstraction, such as War Worker, which has this, it's a tempera painting, and you have these incredibly sharp lines of the facial features, and then sweeping brushwork that really creates a dynamic rhythm around the face. And I think it's just this incredibly sort of expressive and empathetic composition. And all of this, for her, was setting the stage for an important project about to start. That's because in 1945, she received a prestigious award. It was the Julius Rosenwald Foundation Fellowship, which supported her work for an initial 1-year period and then was actually renewed, so she had 2 years of support. And this is life-changing money for her. And she based her application on her proven ability already to authentically depict Black women and their importance and their contributions to American society. The end result, although she created a number of the works that I've been showing you sort of in a circle around this Rosenwald Fellowship, the most enduring result was an important series of 15 line-cut prints that she originally called the Negro Woman series, and then in 1989 renamed the Black Woman series. And the first work is what I'm showing you here. It's called I Am the Negro Woman, or I Am the Black Woman. And we see this incredibly tight focus on a single face, sort of zooming in on this face. But each work in the series then has a title that, when read together, create almost an epic tale about women's lives, their contributions, but also the challenges that they have faced, especially in the sort of light of the racism, classism, and gender discrimination that have held them back. And I won't read the whole poem, but we do have it in the gallery, but it starts out, I am the Negro woman, and then it goes on, I have always worked hard in America, in the fields, in other folks' homes. So she's starting out with a focus on the very hard labor of Black women. As we see here, she then went on to sort of call out specific women from history that she admired, that had made key contributions. In Sojourner Truth, I fought for the rights of women as well as Negroes. In Harriet Tubman, I helped hundreds to freedom. In Phyllis Wheatley, I proved intellectual equality in the midst of slavery. She also adds on sort of notes about women who are contributing in other ways. They've struggled to organize the unorganized, they've studied, etc. But then the series turns, and it turns with these images here, because this is the moment where she lands on the rewards that a Black woman faces. My reward has been bars between me and the rest of the land. And she then goes on to detail some of the other rewards that they face. Special reservations, for example, segregation in public spaces, or most poignantly, a special fear for my loved ones, which is meant very deliberately to evoke the specter of lynching. The final print is her call to action. She says, my right is a future of equality with other Americans. It's a powerful series. It's one that I think really is in line with her entire ethos. It very much is key to understanding the entire arc of her artistic development for decades to come. It's so sharply, focuses on Black female subjectivity. It prioritizes the narrative power of this arc of a story. And of course, there's an incredible compositional clarity in each print that unites to show an overall story. I think this series really demonstrates how, for Catlett, the personal was political. There was no way that these could be separated from one another. Now, Catlett created the Black Woman series while living in Mexico. She traveled there, in fact, on the second year of her fellowship in 1946, and then shortly thereafter divorced Charles White, and in 1947 married the artist Francisco Mora, who was someone that she would have an incredibly rich artistic and supportive life together. They had 3 sons, and they were together until his death. Now, upon her arrival in Mexico, she began working with the Taller de Gráfico Popular, which is the People's Graphic Workshop. I will refer to it as the TGP to spare you my Spanish. And the TGP was a printmaking collective dedicated to producing inexpensive prints that could circulate widely and carry strong political messages. So it's very much aligned with everything she's already been doing, and certainly aligned with her experiences in Chicago and in New York. And so Catlett became, in fact, one of the only American-born permanent members of the TGP. And you'll see in the section that we've called Prints for the People, Catlett really begins focusing at this moment on what she would come to call her 2 people, which are Black Americans, but as well Mexicans. And one of her most recognized subjects from her time with the TGP was the motif of the sharecropper, which was a theme that she investigated in several different ways. And so it's exciting to see some of these iterations. She actually initially started with a small print of the male sharecropper, which you see on the left, and then also explored the subject in oil painting. But I think many of us are more familiar with where she lands, the extraordinary composition that she calls sharecropper that was a linocut. And she printed it over and over again. She distributed this print very willingly, very freely, because she wanted it to be out in the world. She printed it in black and white, she printed it in color, and it really is a print that shows how adept she was. You have this incredible mastery of linocut. Look at all of the different sort of forms of shading that create the hat and her background and her outfit. We have the same angular figural style that we see her perfecting over time. And of course, this composition where this figure seems so dignified and self-assured with, again, the same little lift of the chin. But members of the TGP did not work just alone. This was a collaborative organization. And so they often worked on joint projects, and Catlett spearheaded one in specific that was called Against Discrimination in the United States. So she's working with Mexican artists in the TGP about topics in the United States. And so they ended up selecting key figures, Black men and women from history, who again had made tremendous contributions but were largely invisible in history books or the fine arts. So she chose Harriet Tubman. So again, Harriet Tubman is a beloved figure for her. But other artists chose all sorts of different figures, such as Nat Turner here, or authors, politicians, and so many others. It's actually quite a large series, so we just have a small selection in the exhibition. One of my favorite prints in the show from the TGP section is the peace poster, which is actually in the Art Institute's collection, so it's one that I've known for many years. And this is such an extraordinary print. First of all, it is monumental in size. And it's a work that Catlett designed the image, and Alberto Beltran, her colleague at the TGP, actually carved the linoleum. So that's another form of collaboration that we see. And so we see this giant protective hand shielding a group of workers and peasants, and most prominent among them, of course, is this mother and child who stands there sort of protecting her child, but also very defiant about the threat that is coming. Now, Catlett's career continued to thrive in Mexico throughout the 1950s, well into the 1960s. She became the first woman to teach sculpture at UNAM, which is the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and shortly thereafter became head of their sculpture department. She would continue this work as a teacher for another 15 years. Again, something that was with her throughout her whole life. But as I mentioned, she was by this point under surveillance by the CIA, as was, incidentally, the entire TGP. And because this is, of course, the height of the Cold War. And so she was deemed deeply suspicious and exiled, as I mentioned. But I mention this again, because I think it is in some ways because of this exile that she very freely engaged and aligned herself with now broader Pan-American struggles for peace and freedom. And there's a great section, one of my favorites, on global solidarity, where we see all of the different ways that she remained actively thinking about what's happening in the United States, but also thinking about what's happening in Central America and in South America. And this is a work that is quite amazing called Black Unity, which is a double-sided sculpture, I'm showing you front and back, of the raised fist and then two figures, or two faces. And this is very much a work that she created in 1968 in support of the Black Power movement. Now think about what this moment was. 1968 is, of course, the year of the Mexico City Olympics, something that would have been very near to her, where most famously the clenched fist was associated with solidarity. We see Catlett then repeating the motif in Homage to My Young Black Sisters, also in 1968. So it's clearly a motif that grabs her and is one that she wants to support as much as possible. But as I mentioned earlier, many of her sculptures were deliberately more universal. And this was something that she did purposefully to allow them to speak across national boundaries. So Political Prisoner is a work that actually has a very specific referent for its origin. She was inspired by photographs of Angela Davis being arrested in 1970. But she very deliberately moved away from any specific reference to Angela Davis. She said that she wanted the sculpture to represent, quote, not just Angela Davis, but all the political prisoners, and we have a lot of them here in Mexico. So she's thinking about, again, more than just Black power. But of course, printmaking allowed her to be incredibly specific, and again, continued to cross national boundaries to address the politics of Central and South America. And there's a group of 4 prints that I'm really fascinated by, and the first one of them is Alto Alegracion, which is the one on the left, which in 1954 she created to protest US intervention in Guatemalan politics. But she then lets this print sort of sit dormant for a couple decades. And then in the 1980s, after making 2 additional works about Chilean politics and the US intervention in Chilean politics, she then combined all of these compositions together into a very large print that she called Central America Says No. And so once again, we see this sort of incredible use of repetition here. And this is, in terms of scale, very large. So she's thinking about making an impact to allow these elements of repetition and scale to really amplify her message against US intervention in foreign politics. Now, in 1971, the United States finally granted her a visa. And that was to, in fact, celebrate a major show of hers that was held at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1971, in the fall of 71. And I should mention, it would not be until 2002 that they sort of granted her, they reinstated her citizenship, some 40 years after it was revoked. Along the way, she retired from active teaching in 1975, but she really continued to make art for decades to come. And that included these large-scale public art commissions like Floating Family, or here a sculpture of Louis Armstrong that is still on view in New Orleans. But throughout, Catlett remained laser-focused on her most enduring subject, which is, of course, women of color. And she continued to use printmaking and sculpture in really inventive ways to advocate for women, for mothers, and for causes that concerned her. And so the final 2 sections of the exhibition, which I'll talk about in tandem, are called Motherhood and Family and The Black Woman Speaks, because it's really exploring together her career-long engagement with these subjects. And that, of course, includes such very tender depictions as this of the maternal bond. This is a small-scale terracotta called Mother and Child that's just incredibly touching. And she's undoubtedly drawing on her own experience as a mother by this point to sort of convey this sense of love and protection. In other works, we see her taking on quite well-known iconography, such as the iconography of the Christian mother and child. Here in a depiction of a modern Black mother, she has short natural hair. Her, is very sort of modern looking, even as she's curling her arm very protectively in front of her 2 children. But her focus on motherhood, I think for many decades, has sort of often been seen as largely sentimental. And I would like to debunk that idea entirely, because it could be, in fact, quite hard-hitting. She was well aware of how Black and Indigenous women in particular faced heightened challenges in raising healthy young children. And so I'm showing you here a poster she made on the left about increased mortality amongst children living in Mexican mining villages. And on the right is a work that she called The Torture of Mothers. and it's about gun violence in Black communities in the United States. And what's interesting is that she based this on a Life magazine article. So she's clearly getting her information from a lot of different sources. But in 1967, Life published a cover image of a young boy who had been shot in police crossfire. And Catlett takes that idea of this prone figure, surrounds it by this, stain of blood red color, and then superimposed it over a larger head to suggest the heartbreak that a mother would face. But despite these hard-hitting works, in all of these works, Catlett celebrates Black women for their contributions, their humanity, their power, and their beauty. As she said, quote, "I wanted to show the history and strength of all kinds of Black women, working women, country women, urban women, great women in the history of the United States." And so we continue to see her working in these more idealized or universal modes, such as Stargazer, where you have this woman reclining in this confident but relaxed pose. She's looking skyward, suggesting hope or aspiration. But of course, it's all rendered in this incredibly lustrous Black marble. And I think this sculpture really demonstrates her command of her skills as a sculptor that she's honed over many years. This is, by now, 1997, so she is well into the later decades of her life. Printmaking continues to be an innovative source or innovative practice for her. This is a print called There's a Woman in Every Color, and it's a quite complex print. It's using both woodcut and linocut printing matrices, and she's depicted a woman's face in both positive and negative space. But what's fascinating also is, of course, the rainbow of colors among these figures to the side here, and those are figures that she's drawn from pre-Columbian motifs. So she's, again, uniting all these different ideas into her works. To convey, in this case, this idea of a rainbow of women. But Catlett's dedication to advocacy for Black women was, again, not even limited by the need to carry an overt message. As I said, the personal was political. So she equally was depicting her family, her friends, other loved ones, allowing their personal characteristics to shine through. And I think we really see that in Young Woman Looking Up and Terry, both of which have this sense of immediacy and freshness that is really appealing. So we have Young Woman Looking Up. It's this lively, quick tempera painting, so she's continuing to paint. And then Terry is a monotype, which is a unique or singular print in which she would have actually painted the image onto a hard surface, such as glass, and then pressed the paper to it to essentially transfer the image. We then actually realized she also was adding drawing onto it on top of that. So she's really sort of dedicating herself to these works that may not look political, but again, was part of her absolute, unwavering dedication to elevating the presence of Black women in the visual arts. In 1984, Catlett wrote, quote, "I am Black, a woman, a sculptor, and a printmaker. I am married. I am the mother of 3 sons and the grandmother of 5 little girls. I am a teacher and a student. I was born in the United States and am now a citizen of Mexico, having lived there since 1946. I believe that these states of being have influenced my work and made it what you see today." And indeed, there is no question that these many states of being were fundamental to the development of Catlett's career. And it can be seen in each and every work, from the most overtly political to the most tender sculpture. But I think, most importantly, what I admire most about Catlett was her determination to say her piece through art. She knew that works of art had the power to inspire and to influence, and of course, she devoted her life to that cause. And I'm showing you here a sculpture called The Black Woman Speaks, which seems to be such an apt symbol for her entire life, her entire career. It clearly represents her conviction that Black women have the right to self-expression, and she chose every single day to exercise that right in the form of hard-hitting prints and sensuous sculptures. So I very much hope that this lecture has given you a little bit of insight into the extraordinary life and art of Elizabeth Catlett, and I thank you again for joining us here today. So I think we have some time for some questions, and I have some colleagues who have microphones. So if you want to raise your hand, they can find you, and we just want them to be a microphone so everyone can hear them. So are there any questions I can answer?
You know, presently, we have so many Black activist women, not only Black, but women of color in Chicago who are young and vibrant and doing various things around immigration issues and politics. And I wonder, has the Art Institute interfaced with young Black lefty activists in Chicago around the Catlett exhibit?
We are working on those sorts of issues. The show just opened today, so give us a little bit of time. But I will say, I think that, Catlett would have so embraced their work and so absolutely been delighted. I think her legacy is the ideas that she carried forward. She was fundamentally a humanist. She wanted life to be better for all people. And so it's great to see that work continue.
And for me, it's thrilling to see this, the richness of artwork in Chicago over time with such a focus on justice and humanism. It makes me really glad I live in Chicago.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
Did Catlett only spend the one summer in Chicago, or are there other times that she connected with Chicago?
She definitely connected multiple times. So I mentioned the summer of 1941, which is when she lived here most actively. She had actually visited before then, and while she was at Iowa in 1940, she actually came to see a Picasso exhibition here at the Art Institute. And Picasso, for all that he is Picasso, was an incredible model for her. Guernica was here. There was sort of a lot of things for her to see. So she made what she called a Picasso pilgrimage in 1940. That's how she met everybody in sort of the Southside Community Art Center orbit. But she definitely visited, again, there was this sort of decade and a half where she couldn't come to the United States. Once she was allowed back in, there were later visits, and the last time I know that she was here was in 2005. We actually awarded her the first ever Legends and Legacy Award from the Art Institute, went to Catlett, and she was here, and we had a show of her prints at that time. So that's the last visit I know of for her in Chicago, but I think there was always a sense of her legacy and presence in the city.
Hello. I have a question on Catlett's relationship with Wood's. How do we know that Wood's pushing of Catlett was one of care and consideration? I'm thinking of how, especially today, the discussion is ripe for Black women artists across the art disciplines and studies of their abuse and neglect from their white institutional mentors and or advisors. Mm-hmm. So what narrative or what receipts do we have regarding their relationship?
So the evidence that we've been largely used on are Catlett's own interviews and testimonials over many years. So this is, sometimes looking retrospectively back a few years, sometimes many years. She did a really lengthy, days and days of oral history in the 1980s that are actually at the Amistad Research Center. So, ultimately, we are going on that as something that she, over many years, looked back on as something positive in her life. Would she have acknowledged it if it hadn't been positive? I think so. She was not someone who was shy about that. So I think it's that. And, Grant Wood was somebody who had faced a significant amount of sorry, losing my words, had been ostracized from the past several years of his life. He would die in 1946, having sort of lost his job, and there were ways that he became a bit of an outcast, but I think he was always very attuned to sort of being an outsider in the art world. Coming from Iowa, he was positioned off as an outsider. So I don't know that that gave him any greater sympathy, but at least from as far we know from Catlett herself, she seemed to get along with him well. But it's a good question.
A question about the actual lino-cut blocks. Where are they? Are they still in existence, or are there examples that we can see?
There aren't examples in the show. I think that there are archives with the family and with, sort of extant TGP archives that are down in Mexico, but we did not borrow any for the exhibition. So you can't see them here, but I do think they still exist. But linoleum, is sort of this, one of the reasons that a linocut was so privileged or so preferred as a medium was that it was cheap. You could carve up the linoleum, it would last for a while, it was durable. So given, like the strength of her community in Mexico, I think those are still all largely down there. I have not, actually. So I am not a printmaking specialist, but I do know that some of the authors who wrote on her printmaking did sort of spend a lot of time with her archives down in Mexico. So. Mm-hmm.
Hi. So as a revolutionary artist, you mentioned both some of the political retribution that she faced, and you spoke a little bit about the way that she was influenced by a number of other artists. Can you speak a little bit about the way that the art world reacted to some of her work and the way that the revolutionary nature of what she was doing was kind of responded to?
Yeah, so it's interesting because even as she was exiled from the United States, she was quite determined to have her artwork come north to the United States. And so, as I understand it, enacted a bit of a smuggling program to ensure that her works were making it into the US. So, friends would come visit, they'd drive across the border and come back with, stashes probably hidden away in their cars because it was essentially not considered welcome in the US. So she's definitely sort of working to make her works visible in the US, and it's succeeding. I mean, the Studio Museum gives her this retrospective because she is circulating these works. She had already been circulating things in the US in like print form, periodicals, things like that. So, I think that there's a way that people that were already in the know continued to seek out her works. Certainly, this was, by the 1950s, an incredibly difficult time for many artists with the Red Scare. And, so a lot of these things did become more covert, but there are ways that they did circulate as much as she could get them to.
I was curious because the idea of motherhood came up so often thematically. About her kids and if they were able to continue the legacy or were doing art themselves.
So her sons are each in their own way artists. One is a filmmaker, one is a musician, one is a visual artist. So absolutely, I think her legacy is continued in their own ways through her children and also her grandchildren. A number of them are sort of interested in filmmaking and other aspects of the art as well. So I think she taught them well. Well, thank you again for all coming tonight. Have a lovely evening.